Hey everybody, good afternoon. Welcome back to this Fiveable APUSH question and answer study stream on Wednesday, April 15. What would have normally been tax day had it not been for this coronavirus. So welcome to that. Hope you folks are doing okay. Glad, Peter, that you are okay despite having a turkey vulture that hit your car while you were driving. Yikes, that's a little scary. Hopefully you folks are doing okay. Just to make sure everything's working okay, go ahead and put something in the chat if you can hear me. Maybe something that's an emoji of the week. Maybe it's something that's like how you're doing with APUSH. Maybe it's something that's new that's happening to you while you're on lockdown and quarantine. But let me know how it's going. Peter's feeling cool as a cucumber. All right, nice job with the shades. Fantastic. Oh, the unicorn. Hey, someone's going to get that complexity point, sounds like. All right. Yeah, so I'm recognizing a lot of you from last night's cram stream. If you weren't there, good idea to get a cram pass. Join us there. Let's see, we got a lot of different emojis going on. Fantastic. I'm glad we can all hear me. Glad we're doing okay. My name is Mr. Lagerway. I'm coming to you live from Western Michigan, where I kid you not, the week after spring break, it is now snowing. And so outside of my window, it's snowing right now, which is just crazy. But, you know, welcome to Michigan, and also welcome to the 21st century and climate change. So let's dive in, talk about some APUSH questions. I'm here for you. Unfortunately, Nikki, I'm not going to be rapping today unless for some reason there's a reference to Hamilton somewhere. But shoot, for that, you got to watch that. That's mostly for the cram passes anyway, right? A little something special there. So that's for the cram pass unit 3-1. But yeah, lots of good Hamilton stuff. Perla's like, ask Hamilton questions. Well, don't do that. Only if you actually have them. So again, into the slides and then some preliminaries, and then we'll get ourselves going. Remember, we do have these weekly free streams that are happening. So Thursdays at 9 p.m. is U.S. history. But if you're taking other APs, we got other ones for you there. And then a couple of upcoming live reviews that you should be aware of. So we have units 3 and 4 getting reviewed. That's the free one coming up tomorrow. Then we have cram session coming up next Tuesday. That's always on Tuesdays. And then question and answer session on Wednesday. Again, just like this, questions and answer a little bit more informal, you know, hoodie kind of hanging out. And then that Thursday is units 4 and 5. I might actually be doing all of those 4. We'll see. It's kind of a crazy time where some teachers have sometimes they have a lot of time, sometimes they don't have a lot of time. And so some of our streamers are busy. I might be picking up some of those. So if you hadn't had too much of my stupid face in the last couple of weeks, feel free to tune into some of those and get some extra Mr. Lagerway and extra APUSH review stuff. So that'll be good. And then if you want to get notified of these, always follow at Think Fiveable, right? That's a good idea. So what are we doing? We're doing your questions. We're doing document-based question breakdown. Again, just talking about the College Board stuff. And I want to give you some tips, give you kind of a more deep dive into the document breakdown if we don't have enough questions, but mostly here for questions. As you can see, it's kind of framing what we're doing here today. So questions, concerns, what are some of the things that you would like to go over today? Because this stream is here for you. And in true teacher fashion, in the middle of my lunch hour at noon today, did you have any burning questions? You can put those in the ask a question function down below. You can put them into the chat. Either one. Angela asked our first question. Fantastic. Okay. After the British won the 7 Years' War and gained land, including those to the Mississippi River, could some of that land still be considered the Native Americans? Yes, absolutely. But to elaborate on that a little bit further, yeah, a lot of the territorial claims of the European powers in the New World are going to be a little bit less than total control, right? They have claims over that. That doesn't necessarily mean they're exercising dominion, sovereignty, or hegemony, or whatever word you want to use for exercising power. They're not necessarily going to be controlling everyone and everything that's in there. Yeah. So the British won the 7 Years' War. Remember that means that they kick out the French from the Mississippi River Valley, the Midwest, the Great Lakes regions, and they take over that territory. But yeah, realistically, they have some forts in the Midwest, and yeah, that's about it. So the Native Americans definitely still control that territory, definitely still a big deal. Peter is asking about what do we have to do for the unicorn point, aka the complexity point. Yeah, there are a variety of ways of getting that complexity point. I would say that by far the easiest way, the way that we're going to actually talk about when we go over the DBQ rubric today, is by doing both sides of the question. So if you have a compare and contrast, you can get complexity for doing both sides. If you have a CCOT, change and continuity. If you have a comparison, similarities and differences. That's the easiest way to get the complexity point. If you're consistently getting 6 out of 7 points on your DBQs, okay, yeah, then look at the complexity point. But otherwise, I wouldn't worry about it too much. It's 1 of 10 points this year, and it's, yeah, when I graded, well, pretty much every year that I grade about anywhere from 700 to 1,000 essays at the AP reading, depending on what I'm reading and how fast and how well they are and all that kind of stuff. And I would say each year maybe 10 to 15. So we're talking 1%, if not less, of the students get the complexity point. It's one of those, you know it when you see it type things, but it's also one of those just rewards for good writing throughout. And then Nikki, yeah, for causation, you do need to mention causes and effects in order to get the, well, it's one way to get the unicorn point, the complexity point. So there's a variety of ways. The easiest one is to do both sides of the question. And so causation would be causes and effects. However, there are other ways to do it too. One of my best pieces of advice for getting this point in general, besides do both sides of the question, is make sure that you're tying in your paragraphs to your topic sentences, which are connected to your thesis. Make sure the essay flows very nicely. It has to be a well-written essay to get the complexity point. Secondly, the other way to make sure you're getting the complexity point is add nuance whenever possible. So this could be both sides of the equation, but whenever you can add nuance to your essay, that's a good idea. So gradual emancipation happened up north, and yet there were still some states that had slaves for a very long time. Or many people down south were pro-slavery except for, and then you mentioned something like that. So when it comes to complexity, keep adding nuance, right? The Federalists who supported the Constitution generally wanted a bigger national government than the Anti-Federalists. But people like James Madison, who wrote part of the Federalist Papers, became Democratic Republicans later as they became disillusioned with the size and scope of Hamilton's plan. So you have a little bit of a nuance. It's like although this is true, there's also this exception. Or, well, let me add some gray. Let me add some shading. Let me add some nuance. Whenever you can make things more complex, you're doing a better job of getting toward that complexity point. So that would be a good idea. And then, Angela, you were saying your class taught you to do major and minor causes, but both sides for CCOT and comparison. Yeah, you can do major and minor causes. It might not be a bad idea to do effects too. Just add a paragraph as kind of a conclusion. But yeah, if you mention multiple causes, you're well on your way toward writing a fantastic essay anyway, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. Okay, so Perla was asking about the progressive movement, and Peter's asking about the in 45 minutes, yeah, time management and all that stuff. Yeah, let's talk about that. Oh, sorry, Nikki. CCOT is change and continuity over time, aka how did things change or stay the same in this time chunk? Great question. Let's see. Yeah, Perla, if you want to link that doc in the chat, that'd be great for how to help with the most important points. We're going to go through that a little bit later too. Perla, let me get your progressive movement question answered, and then we'll dive into the DBQ document stuff, so that way people can get that question answered too. Lemon LaCroix. There's nothing better. Except for pop, but that destroys you from the inside. So trying to be a little healthier on this quarantine. Here we go. So Perla, you were talking about the progressive movement and when did it emerge and how did it emerge? Okay, so in order to do that, we need to kind of set ourselves up. Let's do some contextualization. When are we? So we're talking toward the end of the 1800s. We're talking in the early 20th century, early 1900s. And the progressive movement is going to be a response to the Gilded Age. So the Gilded Age is that second industrial revolution. It's period 6. It's after the Civil War, as Nikki was saying. And after the Civil War, let's say the progressives, they kind of come out of the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act reform movements of the 1880s. But the progressives are really going to start going after about 1890 or so and through roughly 1920 or so. All right. So they're going to be interested in doing a lot of reform, sure, but also ways to make the Gilded Age less stinky for people, right? Oh, Perla put that document there. Fantastic. Works for me. Yeah, okay. Looking through some of that stuff. All right. Yeah. Yep, we'll go over something very similar pretty soon. Yeah, so Perla, answering, was it your question about the progressive movements? Yeah, so progressives are a response to the Gilded Age. That's the biggest thing to remember. So there are a lot of upper middle class white women in urban areas. They're going to be addressing problems, a lot of it in cities. So you're going to see people like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the women who want to get the right to vote. You're going to see Jade Adams and Hull House trying to make the cities cleaner, safer, etc. And then you're also going to see a lot of prominent politicians who are progressives as well, right? So you got the Wisconsin Plan, you have Robert La Follette, you have the three progressive presidents, right? Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. And so progressivism kind of spans between parties. You're also going to see the progressive era amendments, 16, 17, 18, 19. Direct taxation, direct election of senators, abolition of alcohol, women's right to vote. Yeah, Taft is considered a progressive. He's a Republican, but again, he takes trust busting to a whole new level, kind of like what TR was doing. And so, yeah, Taft is considered kind of a progressive. Teddy Roosevelt doesn't like some of the things that he does, but he at least claims the title of progressive and helps to further some of those causes. Yeah, so the progressive presidents would be Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Wilson's going to do a lot of civil service reform. He's going to resegregate the government because he's a racist jerk. But he is going to do things like the Federal Reserve System. And then you have examples like the Pure Food and Drug Act under Roosevelt, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, Interstate Commerce Committee, stuff like that. So yeah, we're going to see a lot of presidents get involved. Remember things like the initiative, the referendum, the recall, trying to clean up machine politics, especially in urban areas. So Rhea, Teddy Roosevelt is the one that starts the trust busting. McKinley was not really interested in a whole lot of that kind of stuff, but partially because he was elected by lots and lots and lots of corporate money. But Teddy Roosevelt starts the trust busting, and then Taft is going to continue some of that. Yep. Let's see. Did FDR start as a Democrat for his term and then create the Progressive Party for the next election and part of his campaign? No. No, sorry. When I say Roosevelt is a progressive, I mean Theodore Roosevelt. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, he is going to be a Democrat the whole time. What gets a little bit confusing, this is where we get into the political history of stuff, is Democrats mean different things at different points in history, right? So back during the Civil War era and the Reconstruction era, Democrats were incredibly conservative and were the party of racism and the KKK and stuff like that. FDR is going to begin the shift of the Democrats to be more liberal or more small p progressive, not progressive as in like Progressive Party. Is it similar to the Progressive Party? Sure. Does it involve more government, more programs, and addressing social ills that way? Sure. So progressivism is connected to FDR's New Deal Democratism, which is also connected to LBJ's Great Society, but that's in the 60s and thus beyond the scope of this year's exam. So FDR begins the shift where he works with conservative Southern Democrats who are very conservative and very racist, and he works with some of them to be able to get his New Deal passed. But he's also bringing in the so-called New Deal coalition, so that'll involve African Americans, poor people, union people, Jewish people, a lot of people that can that still vote a lot along the lines of the Democratic Party to this day. But of course, the New Deal is very segregated and very racist because he still has to work with those conservative Southern racists during the 1930s. Then Nikki, you were asking about the populists. The populists, I'd say, are around the same time, maybe a little bit earlier. So the populists would be, remember, disaffected, angry farmers out west. They're mad about, well, let's say railroad monopolies. They want the government to get more involved in stuff. They're the ones that want the free coinage of silver so that way we can have bimetallism, silver and gold, because that will increase inflation, which helps them out because they're all in debt. If you owe $100 and then suddenly inflation goes way up and $100 is worthless, you still only owe $100. So you owe someone a worthless debt that you have no trouble paying off. And as prices go up, people pay more and more for your crops. So you're happy about that. So populists are going to be down south a little bit, think sharecroppers and other agricultural areas, and out west during, I'd say, the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s, last 3 decades of the 19th century. They are going to come out of things like the Grange and the Farmers Alliance and stuff like that, these social circles that eventually turn into economic cooperatives that eventually turn into a national party. And a lot of what they propose is eventually adopted, right? The direct election of senators, the coinage of silver is not adopted at that time, but they do have things like the direct income tax. They want to have a sub-treasury system where the government stores some of their crops. That doesn't happen, but some of the trusts do get busted, particularly like Northern Securities Railroad and stuff like that under Teddy Roosevelt. Ooh, all right, we had a bunch of questions there. Sounds good. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for sticking with me. Let's go into the DBQ rubric and kind of break that down a little bit, and then we'll get your questions as we go. And if you have more questions that are not related to the DBQ but are related to other content, put that in the ask a question function down below, and that way I can save them and get them for us later. And then if you have questions about the DBQ as we go, put that in the chat, and that way it'll keep running, and that'll be helpful. All right, so the College Board announcement, remember we have a modified DBQ. It's going to be online. It's 45 minutes long, 5 minutes to upload. This year for AP Histories, it has 5 documents, one of which is going to be non-textual. So that could be a cartoon, could be a map, could be a picture. We just don't know, but something you don't have to read quite as much, a little more visual. It's going to be from units 3 to 7. And so thus units 1 and 2 can be useful for contextualization. But if you watched the cram pass on units 1 and 2, I'd say you're good to go. Maybe glance at it a little bit more, but other than that, move along. It is open note and open book, because how could it not be? But please be careful about this, right? As I mentioned in the stream last night, for those of you that were there, don't be copying things. Don't be writing the same thing as your partner. Don't be sharing things in group chats and stuff like that. That just, you're going to get caught. You're going to get your score invalidated. It's just not worth it, right? You've put in a whole year's worth of work, and this is the one thing that gets to evaluate you on your year's worth of work. So make it worth it and do a good job. Put it in your own words. And then also, I mean, you have also 45 minutes, right? So you don't have a whole lot of time. So don't be spending a ton of time looking through your book and looking through your notes. Have some stuff prepared. If you want to know more on that, check out the cram sessions. We're talking about that and creating some resources and things. And then it is a 10-point rubric, and so we'll walk through that because the 10-point rubric is essentially an expanded rubric of past years. So there we go. So steps to writing the DBQ. How do you do this? What does it look like? Here's just kind of my recommendation as to how I teach my students to do this and how you should do it as well. First of all, you want to analyze the prompt, right? You always want to be breaking down the prompt, understand what it says, because if you don't understand what they're asking you to do, you're probably not going to be able to do it correctly. That'd be a good idea. You want to read and annotate the sources that they give you. Now, what that looks like online, we'll have to wait and see for some of the practice. They're going to have a simulation of the exam come out on the College Board website late April or so. Oh, nice. We have an online AP cheat sheet for APUSH. Thanks, Perla. That might be helpful. Let's see. Oh, I was going to paste a link to the rubrics in just a little bit too. I'll put that down below in case anyone wants to look at that. So read and annotate the sources. You want to make sure you're knowing those. Plan your essay. Take time to plan your essay. It's a 45-minute period. Suggestions range from anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. And then start your writing. So don't dive in right away. Make sure you're doing some planning. So what does that look like? Well, again, 10 to 15 minutes for that part, and then about 30 to 35 minutes for that part. 45 minutes total. Remember, you have 5 minutes to upload. Should be good. So how do you break down a prompt? What does that look like? What does good prompt analysis look like? So we got ourselves, first of all, the historical thinking skill. Are they asking you a compare contrast, a causation, or a CCOT question? Now, in general, in past years, they've made it so that it's specifically one particular skill that they're asking for. And then starting, I believe it was last year, if my memory serves me correct, they said you can answer with any of those. But usually they're written in such a way that they can give you specifics and they can give you, you're like, oh, this is a causation prompt. Can we see examples of each of those? Sure. Yeah. I have a ton of those on the cram pass slides and things like that. I don't have any slides for that, but we can talk through that real quick. So again, compare, contrast. That's just talking about similarities and differences. So it might be period 3, compare, contrast loyalists and patriots. Compare and contrast Hamilton and Jefferson. Period 4 might be compare and contrast Whigs, compare and contrast the North and the South. Compare and contrast Whigs and Democrats, compare and contrast the North and the South, compare and contrast the American system and Jackson's ideas. Period 5, you might talk about comparing and contrasting the North and the South during the Civil War, comparing and contrasting different views on Reconstruction. Period 6, compare and contrast the roles of women in period 6 versus other periods, comparing and contrast the first and second industrial revolution, like Lowell Mills and period 4 market revolution stuff with heavy industry in period 6. Period 7 could be comparing and contrasting views on changes in the 1920s, compare and contrast views on FDR's New Deal. A lot of examples. Just any time that you can compare it with somebody else, or somebody's arguing about something or debating over something, that's always a given for a compare contrast. Causation, pick any major event and talk about what caused it and what were its effects. The American Revolution, what caused it, what did it change? Washington's presidency, Hamilton's financial plan, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, Reconstruction. What causes the Civil War? What does it affect? The Market Revolution. What causes the Market Revolution? What does it affect? The Second Great Awakening. What does that cause? And what caused it? Period 7, like imperialism would be a really great one. What causes imperialism and how does that change the United States and the rest of the world? A lot of options there. And then CCOT, this is basically anytime they give you a causation prompt, but over a certain length of time. So they talk about how did something change over this time period? Yeah, and would there be some documents that showed how it caused it and others show its effect, or how would the documents work? Great question. Generally speaking, yes, the documents are going to be leading you, hinting you in a particular direction. So let's say it was a CCOT, so change in continuity over time for slavery in antebellum America. They might give you one that talks about the Missouri Compromise, and you're like, oh, okay, Missouri Compromise. Americans are compromising over slavery. They're managing to make it work. Then you might get another document that's over like Bleeding Kansas. Well, that's clearly showing that compromise is no longer working by the 1850s. So that's it should suggest to you that things are getting more acrimonious, they're getting more violent, less compromising over time, something like that. Same thing with cause and effect. So they might give you, for the Civil War, they might give you something about manifest destiny, and you're supposed to talk about westward expansion and arguments over slavery. And yet they might also give you, again, a John Brown article with raid on Harper's Ferry. So you're supposed to say, not only is there debate over slavery in Congress over new states, there's also all of this violence that's occurring, and that's going to be a big deal. So CCOT, that could be a lot of different things, like evaluate how Americans changed over time, how Americans debated over politics is what I'm going to give you in a little bit. Talking about politics is a big deal in period 3, 4, 5, a little bit in 6, and a little bit in 7 as well. Yeah, that's good. So find out what historical thinking skill it is and try to evaluate it, the prompt, and the documents based on that. You want to look at categories and themes. Does the prompt talk about political changes? Does it talk about debates over the economy? Does it talk about foreign policy? Does it talk about women, African Americans, Native Americans, urban city dwellers, right? If they give you a topic, you need to be addressing that topic specifically. Also, you should be aware of the time period, because if you write outside the time period, it might work for contextualization, but it might just be totally wrong. You have to have evidence in the time period. Here was an example for you. Evaluate the extent to which debates over the size and scope of the American government changed from 1785 to 1800. Yes, Ria, this is a CCOT prompt. So let's break it down. Right here we got, oops, this is going way too fast. This is a CCOT prompt. It talks about how it changed during this entire period, right? By the way, why did they give you 1785? That's a question you could probably answer in the chat there. Why did they give you 1785? Or why did I give you 1785? What did I want to make sure to include in the time period? 1785 is 2 years after the Treaty of Paris ends the Revolutionary War. So it does include the Articles of Confederation, yes. And what's going to happen 2 years later to the Articles of Confederation? It's going to go away because in 1787, another must-know date, we are going to see First Continental Congress is before. That's before the Revolutionary War. Ria's got it. Yes, the Constitution in 1787. And then 1800 is going to be the election of Thomas Jefferson, a.k.a. really early stuff. Washington, Constitution, Adams, Articles of Confederation. Talk about that. What's the category and themes? We're talking about American government. This is going to be a political prompt, the size and the scope of American government. What should the government be allowed to do? What shouldn't it do? How strong should it be? How weak should it be? Federalism, states' rights. How does that all work? So that's what you want to be talking about. So Perla, the change to the Constitution happens because of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and the ratification of the Constitution that happens basically over 1788, Federalist Papers, etc. So Constitutional Convention and then the ratification of the Constitution is probably the event that you're thinking about. And then the time period, again, just make sure that you're talking about the appropriate times, because otherwise you won't be getting points if you're talking about Andrew Jackson, who's alive during this time, but not really relevant, right? So how do you analyze documents? Well, Angela, yeah, for this document, we're talking about American government. So are you limited to only talking about political things? Well, you certainly should be spending a majority of your time talking about political things. Now, if you want to add in some economic stuff, I mean, the two are very closely aligned, right? So Hamilton's financial plan is a government program for growing the U.S. economy. So you're adding some economic stuff there. And that's actually another way to get complexity. If you were to add some stuff about social changes or economic changes or environmental changes or something like that, that might work. You just need to make sure it's tied in and relevant. And I would not spend a majority of your essay talking about that. So talk about political stuff and then maybe talk about Hamilton's financial plan. That's what I would do personally. And that might be a nice way to tie in some economic stuff and get some complexity a different way. Yeah, good question. So how do we analyze documents? Well, first of all, you want to be summarizing and paraphrasing as you're going. Never, 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 never quote. Tie it to the prompt, and then you hip it. What does this all mean? Well, you also need to be grouping it together, right? So you summarize, you paraphrase the documents. That's what's called using the documents. We'll talk about that point. And then you tie it back to the prompt. That's more points. When you hip the document in a way that's relevant and helps your argument, that's also another point. And then grouping is always helpful just because you want to be able to put these into specific categories and paragraphs, essentially. Yep. Let's see. Perla was asking kind of no embedding quotes. Like if you have to quote a two-word phrase because it's something that's totally like unreplicatable, right? And you can't paraphrase it, sure. But if you're quoting more than 2 or 3 words, you're not doing it right. The readers know the documents. It's a waste of your time and ours. You have 45 minutes. Don't quote the documents. You get no points for quoting. You get points for summarizing, so that way I know that you know what you're talking about. The first point is just using 2 documents somewhere in your essay that sneezes in the direction of what they're talking about. So as long as you can say, hey, Jefferson's talking about how he doesn't like Hamilton, and Hamilton's talking about how he likes manufacturing, that's a point right there, because you use 2 documents. Don't use quotes. This is not English. It is a specific kind of writing specific to history. So English is great. Don't do that in history. Perla was talking about the Wizard of Oz comparison, so that we could use it in our essays about later topics since all teachers know it. As graders, is using that accepted? Perla, are you talking about like using the Wizard of Oz as an analogy for the populists and like the Yellow Brick Road and Silver and stuff like that? The Wizard of Oz, the movie or the book or something like that? Because if you wanted to use it as, I mean, it could be a way for you to think about it. I wouldn't necessarily just throw it in there in any random time. Yeah, Pearl. Yeah. So if you're talking about if the event is on the Populists and you're talking about we're off to see the wizard, and you mentioned like the Tin Man as the workers, the Scarecrow as farmers, and stuff like that, and the Cowardly Lion as William Jennings Bryan, stuff like that. Sure, I would maybe spend maybe 2 sentences on it. It might be considered outside evidence because it was written during the time period, depending on what kind of time period they give you. But I would not make your entire essay structured around that, and I certainly wouldn't mention it if it wasn't an essay about the Populists, right? Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Okay, so then document analysis, what does that look like? Let me make myself a little bit smaller and make this a little bit bigger just so we can zoom in a little bit here on the document analysis stuff. So document analysis, you might use HIP, you might use HIPPO. I like to use HIPPO myself. And so historical context, intended audience, point of view, purpose, and outside evidence. A brief note about that. Outside evidence, if it is tied to a document, is almost always counted as historical context. If you want the outside evidence point that's in the rubric, try to make it unrelated to the documents. Now, it might be spurred and sparked by the documents, but don't make it so closely connected with the document that suddenly it's going to be historical context. And then I'm going to keep saying this until I'm blue in the face, because as a person who's read a lot of DBQs, this is crucial. This is one of the best pieces of advice I can give you. You only have to do one of the HIPPs. However, most students that attempt to do IPP do so really poorly. So first of all, try to do historical context if you can. And secondly, if you have to do IPP, you have to do them all together. Not according to the rubric, but according to what I know about students, what I know about writing, and what I know about how we grade these things. So you can't be just saying the intended audience of the speech was Congress. That doesn't add anything. The point of view of the author is someone who was a Federalist. The purpose was to talk to people about what the document's about. That doesn't help. IPP has to be what I'm going to call later value added. It has to be something where you're adding something beyond just what they tell you. They almost always tell you who they're talking to, who's talking, and a tiny bit about them in the sourcing information itself. If they tell you that in the document sourcing on the exam, you don't get any points for just parroting that back, right? So how do you make the point of view or audience contribute to your argument? Great question, Ria. What you want to be doing here is I like to talk about each document as an example of a larger point that I'm making. So, for example, let's say we're doing a Hamilton-Jefferson comparison, and you have Hamilton's financial plan, a brief excerpt. You would say, Hamilton's financial plan, which was written to Congress to convince them that his economic plan would be the best for the country going forward, expressed Hamilton's belief that the United States should be a heterogeneous economy with both manufacturing and agriculture. Jefferson worried that this would benefit the northern banking elites, but Hamilton saw this as a means to get prosperity, trade, and to be able to get the U.S. economy on par with that of Britain's or something like that. So you're using each of these documents as an example of a larger point that you're making when you're maybe talking about how Hamilton and Jefferson had different visions for the United States economy. Something like that. Exactly. You need to talk about why the IPP matters and why it supports your argument. Ria, I literally went to school for years and years and years to do this, so don't worry about it. You'll be fine. But you'll be able to write good essays. Again, as long as you keep asking yourself, why do I need to know that? Why do I care? And then use each document as an example to be able to go back to your thesis, whatever that happens to be. So let's dive into the actual rubric itself. Here's kind of what it looks like, just to make sure that we all have it down. It's 10 points. Thesis, contextualization, those have not changed. We'll do deeper dives into that as we go. Use the content of 2 documents. Again, that's just sneezing in the direction of, I know what this document says. Then if you use 2 documents to support your argument, tie it back to your thesis, that gets you another point. If you use 4 documents to support your argument, that gets you another point. That's why doing this, tying back to your thesis, is so important. Using outside evidence, 1 piece, 2 piece, or even more. And that's why ACE is so important, right? And then hipping 1 document, hipping 2 documents, that's another 2 points. And then you finally, your complexity, your unicorn point. All right. If you want at the bottom of the page, there should be a link to the AP History's rubrics for the 2020 modified DBQ from the College Board. That has this with some descriptions. You can read over that. It's fairly helpful. I like the way they lay it out, and I like the way they describe it. So let's get into what this means and kind of break it down for you and give you some ideas. Tedious, yeah, absolutely. You should use all 5 documents if you can. If you can use all 5 documents to support your thesis, that would be great. If you can hit 3 documents to give yourself a buffer, do it. I'm a big fan of buffers. So going in the order of what you should see in your essay. First of all, contextualization. You technically can put contextualization wherever you want in your essay, but I almost always see it at the beginning of the essay. This is an English class called like the setting. It's setting the scene. It's at the beginning of your essay. It can be anywhere, but start your intro paragraph with this. Don't mess around. Just put it at the beginning of your intro paragraph. So talk about something that is before the time period that maybe goes into the time period. People have different opinions as to like what the rule of thumb is. Is it 50 years? Is it 30 years? You don't worry about going back a whole lot. Try to make it as close as possible without going back too much. Okay, so Rhea asked for a couple of good examples of contextualization. Let's say you're talking about, we're going back to that Hamilton-Jefferson stuff. You might want to talk about how the United States is constantly caught between the French and the British, and how there's that going on in the broader context of foreign affairs, and how that's going to influence then Washington's farewell address, Washington's neutrality statement, something like that. If it was an essay about Andrew Jackson, well, I would probably mention the antebellum reform movements that are occurring during the time period, the market revolution, the Second Great Awakening, something like that. If it's about Reconstruction, yeah, exactly. You can't just be like, this happened before. It has to be relevant, and the relevance is on you. So yeah, you don't necessarily need a hook in this case. History writing is much less flourishy and fancy and floofy than English writing is, right? The point here is not to be an amazingly flowy writer. The point here is to get down to business. You have 45 minutes. It's an artificial construct. You won't write like this in college. You won't write like this anywhere else. Just get down to business and defeat the Hun, as Mulan says, right? Get down to business. So start your first paragraph with during the 18th century, or start your contextualization with at the beginning of the American Republic, etc. The thesis statement should be at the end of the intro paragraph. We'll get to that later, Sierra, but great question. Start with contextualization. You may have learned the inverse triangle in elementary school for writing, or for middle school for writing intro paragraphs. Start broad, get specific. That's how you want to go here. So let's say we had a paragraph or an essay on the New Deal. You probably want to start with the Roaring 20s and how that led to the economic collapse of the Great Depression, and then talk about the New Deal. If you're talking about imperialism, start with Manifest Destiny, westward expansion, trade overseas, and then get to why we're having imperialism. If it's a question about comparing women, oh, by the way, one of the things, if it's comparison, talk about both periods. Why not? But a comparison could be like a cause or an effect of what you're talking about in the essay. Yeah, I suppose it could be. I would say more cause. Just because it flows better, talk about something that's happening just before or during the time period. If there's an essay on immigration in the antebellum era, we'll talk about the market revolution, because that sets you up really nicely for talking about during this time period, all of this stuff is happening, and that's going to lead to more and more immigrants coming in, Irish and Germans, something like that. Again, it has to be relevant, and relevancy is on you, but choose a different theme. Again, if it is a political theme, maybe talk about what's going on in the economy at the time that's relevant. For comparison, could you talk about something that happened in between that connects them for context, or would that not work? Yeah, I think it would. Yeah. So if it's comparing, say, Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity, talk about the American Revolution, the early American Republic, maybe the market revolution, something like that could connect the two. Sure, that works. So contextualization, that's what you've practiced all year. Hopefully you've been doing that at least in small bits, if not a lot. And then another way to think about this is like the previously on, if it's like a TV show, right? Previously on this show, previously on APUSH, we saw this. Now we're going to this, or the Star Wars scroll, right? Where it kind of sets you up. Where are you? The first sentence should tell me when and where in US history I am. You could say anything that happens before, but it has to be relevant. So how do you make sure it's relevant? Well, make sure that it's setting the stage well. Could contextualization be an effect for a causation question? Yeah, it could be, Nikki. Then I wouldn't put it at the beginning of your paragraph. So I'm suggesting that it should be a cause of even the causation stuff, or something that's kind of a broader theme here. So again, in period 4 is really ripe for this. If you're talking about Andrew Jackson or the market revolution, talk about manifest destiny, something that's happening kind of in the background. Westward expansion is constantly in the background. And yes, contextualization should be something that's not in any of the documents. If it's in the documents, it's in the time period, it's what they want you to be talking about in your body paragraphs anyway. Yep. So the thesis, this is also called the setting. Yeah, sorry. The thesis is going to look like this. It's ending the intro paragraph. It needs to respond to the prompt, be specific. It needs to establish a historically defensible line of reasoning. It needs to make an argument. It needs to be historically defensible. It needs to make sense. You can't say something about how the British were colonizing the moon in the 1750s. That just doesn't make any sense. So you need to know your history. That's probably your best defense here. And then if you group the documents, you lay those out in the thesis. Yes, Ria. Now you will never say the word document anywhere in your essay, I would say, but certainly not in your thesis. But yes, when you group the documents, that's how you maybe are going to come up with some of the categories that are going to be in your thesis. And then should we use any evidence from the docs in the thesis? No. Keep the thesis broad, but narrow down to your topic. I'll give you some examples of that. So when you want to talk about categories, when I say categories plus, I mean, it's handy to think about economic, social, political, cultural, geographic, foreign policy, but don't just stop there. You can't say things changed socially and politically. I can't tell you how many times I read that. I'm sick of that, and it's terrible, and it doesn't get you any points. Things are always changing socially and politically. Make it specific to the time period and the prompt. Don't just say things changed socially and politically. That's always true. But you do want to make sure that your thesis statements always have direction and magnitude. What I mean by that is it changing somehow? Tell me how. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Is it becoming more widespread, or is it becoming outdated? Yeah, exactly, a vector. Change and direction. I like it. Yeah, math is a good thing for you. Aim for complexity here. This is where you want to talk about, well, leave both sides of the argument. If you say something like social reform changes and political corruption or something like that, would that still be too vague, Perla? Depends. But again, that's where I would add the direction or the magnitude. So political corruption, did it increase? Did it decrease? Did it come into existence? Well, it's always been there, no. So did it get worse? Did it get better? Social reform, did it incorporate more people? Did it include more issues than before? Was it more successful? Was it less successful than it used to be? Something like that. Don't include examples. That's the point of your body paragraph, right? Your body paragraphs prove your thesis. So examples belong in your body paragraph. Don't drop vocab in your thesis unless it's something so broad that you have other vocab that can back it up. So if you say, let's say it's about like American foreign policy from 1800 to 1850. Okay, well then maybe you could say something about the Mexican-American War or about the War of 1812 because you know lots about that. But remember, if you get really specific in your thesis, you have to get even more specific in your body paragraph to be able to prove that thesis, and you're writing yourself into a corner unless you know a whole lot of stuff. So save your vocab for your body paragraphs. Describe the vocab in a way that's a little bit broader, but still specific to the time period. I'll give you some examples. In your thesis, how do you get complexity? Here's kind of the way to do it, right? We talked about before, do both sides of the prompt, change and continuity, cause and effect, similarities and differences. And then here's a really nice way to go in your thesis here. Don't tell your, you should tell your points or main ideas in your thesis, but don't use vocab. So again, talk about how slavery became a bigger issue in antebellum America, or how political compromise became less possible, but don't say the compromise of 1850 shows. Like, don't mention Kansas, Nebraska, or the Liberator, or things like that. Save that for your body paragraphs. Excuse me 1 second. Just need to blow my nose. All right. So A good way to get complexity with your thesis is to kind of fill out this prompt form. Although this happened, that's your counter argument, because this and this, therefore blank. So although all Americans agreed that the British were terrible, because they disagreed on how big the government should be and whether they should have slavery or not, Americans were actually more divided than they were similar in the 1790s. That'd be an example. Usage of documents. Remember, this is summarizing and paraphrasing, no quoting, as we already mentioned. Tie this to your thesis subpoint. Do all 5 just in case. We've already said this, and I want to get to some examples here before we run out of time. When you're hipping your document, we talked about this, value added, right? Do the IPP together. Make sure you're aware of that. Do 3 of them just in case. We mentioned that already too. For the although, ultimately, do you need the therefore part, asked Perla? Not necessarily all the time. In fact, I'll give you an example of one where you don't necessarily have to have it. It's just a nice way to beef it up a little bit. Yeah, and nice job with the HIPPO, right? Nelson got it. Yep, and then here's, again, as I mentioned before, the best advice I can give for how to HIP documents in a way that seems natural and flows well is how do you use documents as example of larger points? We'll talk about this, and I'll show you an example later. For outside evidence, Nikki, you could do HIP for all 5 documents, but it's probably too much. I'd say 3. You just don't have a lot of time. And correct, Tegas, never use quotes. Just don't quote in your entire essay. Just don't quote. No quoting. No quotes. No quotes. Outside evidence. This is evidence, vocab, SFI, whatever you call it, that you bring into the essay related to the topic that proves your thesis. This is where ACE becomes important. So all that practice you've been doing all year on short answer questions is actually pretty relevant because you still need to answer, cite, explain, right? Drop the vocab, say the Compromise of 1850. Tell me what the Compromise of 1850 did. Fugitive Slave Act, yet also California is a free state. And then why does this vocab prove your thesis? Yeah, answer, cite, explain. It kind of means, again, like I defined it in the in the slides right here. So cite something specific. So drop the vocab. That means citing something specific. And then tell me why this document proves your thesis. So this is outside evidence. It's not related to a document. And yeah, when it comes to how you should cite your documents, sorry, in terms of how do we know what document we're using, I would say, and I'll drop this in the chat, do that. Don't write doc, don't write document, just put the parenthesis and the number. You don't even have to do that technically. The readers already will be very familiar with each of the documents, but it makes our lives a little bit easier. Don't spend a lot of time on this. Type it real fast. So do that after you use a document. Do that after you HIP a document. Whenever you're referencing a document, you want to be shouting to the reader, hey, I just used that document, but in a way that doesn't take up a ton of your time. So when you use the document, 3. Then you HIP the document, presumably right after that, 3. That's all you want to do. Don't write document. Don't say according to document or in document 4. The word document should never appear in your essay. I would do the second one, Perla. So instead of saying in document 1, I would say author's name says. Yes, exactly. So you wouldn't say in document 1, they talk about the financial plan. I would say Hamilton said in his financial plan that he proposed a whiskey tax or something like that, right? Don't put it at the end of the paragraph. I mean, you could, but I would suggest putting it immediately after the sentence in which you use it or HIP it. So just you can put it in there multiple times. So you're using it, then you're HIPing it. So you put 3 in there twice. If it's a letter or a law or something like that, can we say the actual name of the document, not Doc 1? Yeah, Rhea, you could. And it's not a bad idea, right? The proclamation line of 1763 or Jackson's message to Congress or something like that. Yep. It just makes it sound a whole lot more professional, a whole lot less amateurish, right? You're not going to lose points for saying document, but whenever I see document, I kind of go, oh boy, here we go, right? So you want to make sure you're acing your outside evidence. That should be good. And then you want to use at least 2 pieces of vocab. I say 2+ because, of course, you need 2 well-done pieces of outside evidence to earn those 2 outside evidence points, but you also want to have more evidence throughout your essay that maybe gives you some value added, especially for those HIP points. right? Okay. Before I get to the last part here, which is going to be examples of this, which I've already shown some of you in the cram session for period 3, what other questions or concerns do you have about the rubric, about the DBQ in general? Should outside evidence be used in our body paragraphs? Yes, Ria. Yes, 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 yes. Yes, please. Is political structure specific enough as part of my thesis? Maybe. It depends. If you said political, but again, I would say you need direction. You need something that's changing. So political structure, what's happening to it? Is it getting more complex? Is it degrading? Is it becoming more focused on the issue of slavery as opposed to economics? What's happening to the political structure? And that's what you need to be telling me in your thesis. Then in your body paragraphs, you show me examples of that. So if the political structure is breaking apart, well, okay, say the political structure began to degrade in antebellum America, and then give me a whole bunch of examples of compromises that started to fail more often, right? Neil's asking, how many paragraphs should we write? Yeah, great question. For sure you want an intro, and then you probably want 2 to 3 body paragraphs. That's 4. If you have time to restate your thesis as a conclusion paragraph, feel free. Yeah, at least rewrite the thesis though. Yeah, if they don't like your first thesis, they can maybe like your second thesis. We're only allowed to give a thesis point for theses that are in the first paragraph and the last paragraph, or the intro and the conclusion. Now, if you're running out of time and you're like, I can either use one more point or use one more document or write a conclusion paragraph, use the document. Don't worry about it. That's why having a good thesis from the beginning is such a big deal, right? So unfortunately, this is not English, right? And it's timed. It's just artificial. We have to do some hoop jumping, point grubbing. Drop your essay off a cliff. You don't have to worry about conclusion paragraphs. If you have time to restate your thesis, good. That's your conclusion paragraph. Otherwise, just be fine. So how many documents should you use per body paragraph? I don't know. It really depends on how you group them. You can have 5 documents in one paragraph. You could have 1 document in one paragraph. You could have no documents in one paragraph. In fact, that's honestly a pretty good way to use outside evidence sometimes. So don't worry about the number of documents you have per paragraph. Put them into categories that make sense and write 1 paragraph per category. That's what you want. Let's see. Angela was asking, can I compare Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity? Yeah, kind of like what I was mentioning earlier there. Republican motherhood is going to be more during the time of the revolution and immediately after, think 1780s and 90s. This is, hey, women, stay at home, take care of the kids, raise them to be good, virtuous citizens. You're contributing to the republic by being good mothers of future citizens who will either raise up future citizens or vote themselves if they are boys. So cult of domesticity, I'd say 1780s, 1790s, think women raising up the next generation of voters in the early republic. Cult of domesticity is going to be more happening during the market revolution. Think 1810s, 20s, 30s, 40s. And that's going to be related to the market revolution because as women begin to work outside the home a little bit, it's not necessarily a good thing in the minds of some people. And so they start to have separate spheres. So the cult of domesticity, domestic, home, right? Domicile. And then it's a cult because it's kind of worshipped in a sense. So women are so great, so beautiful, so fragile. Keep them at home. That's your sphere. You take care of the kids, you cook, you clean. And wow, you're really good at that. I, as the man, will go out and do work in the other places. And that's my sphere. And so the cult of domesticity says, women, you're in charge of the house and you're awesome. So you can kind of compare the two. Yeah. Nil asked, what time period will the question come from? We don't know, except that it'll be from periods 3 to 7. So sorry, all you people from periods 1, 2, and 8, and 9, not included. So that we don't know when the question's going to be about, but it's going to be from periods 3 to 7. That's all we know. And Tigist, you're right. The cult of domesticity is a little bit contradictory because they had more freedom and worked outside the home during that time period. Yes, with a couple of caveats. One, it becomes the ideal partly because it's happening so much, right? People tend to really, really like, let's say, sexual chastity when there's a whole bunch of people sleeping around all the time. Or people really tend to value parks and open spaces when urbanization happens, right? So it's the you don't really know what you got till it's gone idea. So as women begin to work outside the home, you go with the, well, if you were wealthy enough, if your husband was powerful enough, if your husband made enough money, he'd be able to keep you at home because, that's the ideal. Again, very much like the suburban housewife after World War II, right? During World War II, they worked in the factories, but then after World War II, it's like, hey, let's go back. Very crazy. Also, a lot of the people that are working outside the homes during this time period, the market revolution, cult of domesticity time period, are going to be young, unmarried girls. So from the ages of, let's say, 15 to 20, 25, maybe, something like that. So they're unmarried. They're done going to school because why would they need more school? And they're not married yet. So you may as well go off to the Lowell Mills or somewhere else, make a little bit of money as you wait for a suitable suitor to come and get your hand in marriage. So you have a little bit more freedom, but eventually you're just going to be married off and then you're not, of course, stay home with the kids and take care of them and cook and clean and all that stuff. So a little bit's an aspirational ideal of like, if you're rich enough, you can stay home. Part of it is just who's involved. Yeah. Great questions. If you get cut off time-wise for a body paragraph, does that look bad? I mean, it doesn't look good, I suppose, but who really cares as long as you've got the points that you need to get, right? They realize we realize as readers that this is an artificial exercise and you're time limited and who knows what you're spending your time on, right? So yeah, if you have to get cut off in the middle of a body paragraph, certainly upload it rather than continue to work and somehow get cut off and then you can't upload anything. Just work as best you can. Start from the beginning. Start with getting the easy points that you think you can get right away. You might not get the unicorn point, yeah, but hardly anyone ever does. So, someone was going to ask about this earlier, and I meant to go back to this. Let me go back to the entire rubric here. So, thesis point. You absolutely should get the thesis and contextualization point. That's why they're in bold. They have not changed. That's your intro paragraph. If you write a good intro paragraph, that's 2 points right there. You got to prioritize. This is almost actually in order of what I think should be doable. Your thesis and contextualization have to be done well. It's the intro paragraph. Set yourself up. Some stuff. Using the content of 2 documents, that should be pretty easy. Sneeze in the direction of what they're talking about, and then use them to support your argument. That's very important, as is outside evidence. So if I had to really, really, really prioritize, let's say I gave you my top 5. Thesis, contextualization, use of content of documents to support your thesis, and a piece of outside evidence. Then you add another piece of outside evidence. Then you add 4 documents that support your argument. Then you HIP a document. Then you HIP another document. And there you're going. Organize your body paragraphs by ideas. So Tegas, that's why I was telling you to organize the documents into categories, because if you can be like, oh, look, all these documents are about slavery, put them all together in a paragraph about slavery, something like that. Yes, use content means summarizing the documents. Yes, good question. Ria, I don't know how many points you need for a 5. That's determined actually after you take the exam and after we score them, because they curve it every year depending on how people do. We just don't know. So let me go back to some examples here. So I gave this example during the period 3 cram pass. If you want a bit more about this and about the sources themselves, watch that one. But let's say we had the U.S. Constitution. Let's say we had an essay by Alexander Hamilton. And notice the example prompt at the top that we've been kind of talking about all throughout this stream. Evaluate the extent to which debates over the size and scope of the American government changed from 1785 to 1800. And then you also are going to have then Virginia-Kentucky resolution right here. This is what an intro paragraph might look like. So during the Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation, that's my vocab that gets me the contextualization point. You don't get points without vocab usually, right? So during the Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation, now that's my citing a specific thing. Now I'm going to define it and tell me why it's important. See you, Ria. Have fun with the physics stream. Thanks for coming. Feel free to watch this whole thing later. It'll be posted on Fileable as always. The Articles of Confederation, what do? They help to unite the different British North American colonies into a loose government for the purposes of defeating Great Britain and gaining their independence. After the U.S. gained their independence, the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the states had to set aside their differences and work together to set up a new government and a new nation, but divisions quickly emerged. So notice how you're using the Articles of Confederation that happens before, but continues into the time period, and then talking about how this sets up divisions. My counterclaim, which is in that fiveable blue there, is although Americans were united in their desire to sustain an independent republic, everybody during this time period wants to be their own country. The loyalists have left or shut up. No one's going, hey, maybe we should get taken over by the British again. That's just not happening. So everybody agrees on that. But are they divided by a bunch of other stuff? Yes. They were increasingly divided. Notice that word increasingly. That the student used as a way to talk about direction. Exactly, Perla. Yes, this student didn't use therefore, but I still liked it enough to include it here and tweaked it a little bit. Increasingly divided over sectional issues like slavery, arguments about federalism and the size of the federal government, and over foreign policy items like European alliances. Could you add a therefore and say, therefore Americans were more divided than they were, or therefore debates got worse during this time period? Maybe. But that word increasingly divided, because notice this is a CCOT question, that word increasingly divided is going to be very helpful for you because it talks about how the divisions get bigger and bigger and bigger as the time goes on. That's a possible intro paragraph. Notice how, other than in the contextualization, I don't have a ton of vocab, right? Slavery, federalism, maybe sort of vocab, but slavery is mentioned. Yeah, sorry, slavery is mentioned in the Constitution. That's I included the 3/5 clause as well as the Fugitive Slave Act portions. Yeah. So how did I get those? Well, because I used each of the documents, and then here's a possible body paragraph. What does that look like? Like this. The newly united states were divided by sectional issues like slavery. That's my first thesis subpoint, with southern states embracing and expanding slavery and northern states stepping away from slavery. Now I'm going to use the document 1 stuff. The southern states continued to fight for the protection of slavery, going so far as to include a fugitive slave clause in the U.S. Constitution. 1. The U.S. Constitution also used 3/5 of enslaved Africans to boost the southern states' representation in Congress. 1. All I'm doing is summarizing what's in document 1. Now, what this person should have done is added another citation of document 1 right here. Not that it matters that much. I mean, that's what I would suggest, right? Because now they're hipping this. These provisions were included so that the southern states would join the constitutional union with the assurance that their property would be protected. That is both intended audience and purpose and point of view kind of together. Something especially important after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. That's historical context. If you want to add a little bit more historical context, or in this case, outside evidence, that's aced. Notice how it's aced. At the same time, gradual emancipation was happening up north. What is gradual emancipation? Ending slavery there over time. So what? Who cares? Leading to more anti-slavery feelings that divided the section of the country from the South. Again, notice you have to talk about the vocab, define what it is, and then tell me who cares and how does this lead to bigger sectional issues like slavery. That's your example right there. Does that make a little bit of sense? Is that somewhat helpful? I'm hoping to include more of those possible body paragraphs and possible DBQ stuff in future cram streams as well. Yeah, this was a good. I cleaned up a little bit of this, but this is a good student. Okay, sweet. So we're basically out of time for today. Thanks for sticking with me, a little bit over time even. Fantastic. If you have more questions, couple of things. One, we're reviewing periods 3 and 4, units 3 and 4 tomorrow night at 9 o'clock. Join us for that if you'd like to. Don't forget about the cram streams that happen every Tuesday. Next week, we're going over period 5. There's even, and I cannot recommend this enough, a bunch of people from this chat and from other chats are joining in on the Fiveable community boards where they're posting resources, posting prompts, doing practice questions. Join us on there. Just look at the Fiveable community page, and that'd be great. All right. I think that's about all the time we have for today. You folks have been great. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for participating, for asking great questions. I hope you're staying safe and sane as you shelter in place wherever you are. Have yourselves a great rest of the day, great rest of the week, and see you next time.